And he also says that local communities do not have much autonomy either because they're intermeshed with the global system and they're dependent on large-scale systems like public utilities and computer networks, highway systems, and mass communications media. And so also operating against autonomy is the fact that decisions of technology that are applied in one locality affect people at other locations far away. So pesticides or chemicals that are used by corporations near a creek or a river contaminate the water supply of people downstream for hundreds of miles. So little changes or applications of technology in one part of the society affect the entire thing. And so it turns out to be the case that the system does not exist to satisfy human needs, but human behavior has to be modified to fit the needs of the system. So the system is not guided by, it's not guided by ideology, but by technical necessity. And every decision within it has to be made in terms of technical necessity and efficiency. It's the needs of the system that are paramount then, not those of the human being. And so the concept of mental health in such a society is that the individual has to be adjusted to fit the system. If he's exhibiting signs of stress, alcoholism, or depression, or spousal abuse, the problem is that he needs to be adjusted. So he's given medications that adjust him to fit the system. The problem isn't the system, it's the individual. And so once again, there's another example of the system tightening up so that there's less and less freedom for the individual. Now he says that in the future, as we go down the road, technological society will begin encountering stresses such as environmental problems, more and more social discontent, rebellion, and revolt that should gradually weaken and erode the strength of the society. And he says that as that happens, then the revolution, individuals who are like-minded to him, will then need to attack, will then need to put the revolution through and attack and dismantle the machine. Because technological society cannot be reformed. It has to be just tossed out and dismantled. So we need to work to heighten social stresses and foment discontent that will weaken the system, and then it'll be necessary to develop an ideology that opposes technology so that when the system becomes sufficiently weakened, it can be revolted against. Then near the end of the essay, he makes a distinction between two kinds of technology, small-scale technology and large-scale technology, and he says that small-scale technologies, he says that it's not the case that technology doesn't ever regress. It doesn't regress until a civilization collapses and falls apart, whereupon the large-scale organizational technology, such as in the case of the Romans, aqueducts that fell apart when the society collapsed, the sanitation system was lost, they lost the knowledge for the building of the Roman roads. Those types of technologies which depend on large-scale organization cannot be, they don't reverse. They get further and further technologized until the entire society collapses. The small-scale technologies, though, are like the local village technologies where a water wheel can be built or small tools can be built, are different, and those remain about the same. And he doesn't really make it clear. I looked, but he didn't seem to me to really make it clear whether he's for the small-scale technologies and against the large-scale ones, or he seems to be against technology, almost in its entirety. But I get the impression that what he wants to do is sort of regress. He opposes nature to technology, and he says wild nature, as he puts it. And he says what he wants to do is to dismantle technological civilization and go back to a state of nature, wild nature. And he recognizes that this will be traumatic. It's going to cause a lot of suffering, but he thinks that it will be, in the long run, less suffering than if the system survives and continues exerting these stresses and strains on individuals over time. So he's got a kind of archaist model that is somewhat similar. Actually, it reminds me of Lao Tzu's model in the Tao Te Ching, where Lao Tzu was reacting in China against Chinese civilization, especially of the Confucian type. Lao Tzu really hated Confucius. Confucius himself had been an archaist who had wanted to go back to the late Zhou period and its ideals of courtly respectability and performance of the ritual and filial piety for one's ancestors and respect for authority, not questioning it. Lao Tzu absolutely despised all that, and he despised the kinds of learning and scholarly erudition that kind of way of life required. It required the individual to become more in servitude to the civilization, and Lao Tzu rejected all that, went off into the woods and wanted to establish small-scale farming communities And so he sort of wanted to go back. His idea of a utopia was indeed a small-scale farming community with very little technology. And Kaczynski's sort of ideal of regressing back to this small-scale community reminds me of this idea. So there's a kind of romanticism of this back to nature type that has been, it's actually inherent in the American romantic tradition all along. So technology has to be done away with. He comes down very hard on liberals, by the way. He can't be identified as some people have tried to identify him with the environmentalist movement, and what he was doing was a kind of form of eco-terrorism like the Monkey Wrench Gang in Edward Abbey's novel, but none of that works because he wasn't that interested in environmentalism, and he absolutely does not like liberals. He comes down very hard on liberals in the treatise, and he says that, for example, the problem with liberals is that they identify with the victim, and they have this masochistic mentality where they lay themselves down in front of cars, and they're guilt-ridden, and they collectivize. They're interested in collectivizing and in using technology to further collectivizing larger and larger groups. So he says that when we put this revolution through in the future, we anarchists have to be careful not to ally ourselves with liberals or leftists of any kind, because the leftists will always want to use the technology and keep some of it and use it as a means of collectivizing and bringing groups together, larger and larger groups of people together and working in harmony with themselves. And he says that this kind of half measure is like the alcoholic sitting in front of a barrel of wine who reasons to himself, well, if I just have one little drink of it. And we know what the outcome of that's going to be. And he says, so likewise with technology. The whole thing has to be done away with. It can't be reformed. And he looks forward to the day when this will happen and it'll all be over with and regress back to small-scale communities living in a state of nature where, this is a very individualist philosophy. Kaczynski lived in his, cabin in Montana, hunting and trapping rabbits and squirrels, no running water, no electricity. So this is a radical regression that he wants to take society back to. Now the thing about the manifesto is that it reminds me, and it invites a certain comparison with the Maccabean revolt of the 2nd century BC in classical civilization. The Maccabean revolt and the apocalyptic texts, the first Jewish apocalyptic texts, the Book of Daniel and 1 Enoch, were written right about the same time as the Maccabean revolt, 160 BC. And they too wanted to reject a way of life, an entire way of life. In this case, it wasn't industrial society. It was Greek Hellenistic civilization, which was a culture that they identified as having a corruptive and repressive and oppressive influence on Jewish society. So they wanted it out, and they wanted it dismantled. And so they wrote these apocalyptic texts in which you get in the book of Daniel visions of what will come when Greek Seleucid society disintegrates and falls apart, and the ideal state that will emerge out of that. Then you get the Maccabean revolt going on at the same time that these texts are written. And the Maccabean revolt was a very violent reaction to this Hellenistic rulership. So this is a very violent movement, and it reminds me of Kaczynski's violence, and his manifesto here has a very apocalyptic feel to it. So I think we can regard it not only as a type of literature that is that's a type of response to technological society that involves demolition, but it's also it belongs in a kind of neo-apocalyptic genre that looks forward to a period when technological society will no longer exist anymore. Now, the other aspect that interests me about this is that there is a certain similarity to, there's certain isomorphism between how Kaczynski paints this and how the Gnostics, how Gnostic cosmology saw the situation of the individual in the world at that time. Now, in Gnostic cosmology, the whole idea there too was based on freedom and the attainment of freedom and the lack of freedom that the human individual has in the Gnostic cosmos. Now, in the Gnostic cosmos, what you have is the world is a prison that is created by beings that are called archons, and these are these sort of angelic intelligences, each one of which is assigned to a different sphere, a celestial sphere that surrounds the earth. So the earth is encased in these whirling celestial spheres, each one associated with one of the 7 heavenly bodies, one of the 7 traditional planets. And the archons are each identified with one of these. And the head archon is known as Yaldabaoth, and he's actually Yahweh. He's the Jewish Yahweh, that has been turned into the demiurge, and he's the one who has brought the created world into being. And the archons are the ones who build the body. They construct the physical world, which is a prison according to the Gnostics, and the body is a tomb. It's a prison in which the soul has fallen and has been caught and can't get out. And not only that, but his fate is absolutely determined by astrological determinism. The archons rule these planetary spheres, and they exert something called hymarmony, which is fate, that absolutely has a deterministic effect on the individual's life. So that the goal in Gnosticism is to attain freedom from the astrological determinism exerted on him by the Gnostic cosmos. And the way that this is done is through the attainment of gnosis, which is initiation into the mysteries in which it is realized that one's true nature is not this mortal body that is transitory and temporary, but one is a spark of light of the divine intelligence, nous or logos as it's variously called, that has fallen into the body and has become caught there. But through the realization of this knowledge, one attains freedom and is liberated, and the archons become, as it were, these sort of enemies to be fought against, so that the soul, on its way back up through the spheres toward its origins in the light, which is called the pleroma. Pleroma means fullness, and it's the realm of absolute light that exists beyond Yaldabaoth, beyond Yahweh, who thinks that he's the creator God. But there are these other intelligences above him, like Sophia and wisdom and in the eons, that the soul is trying to get back to, and the archons are in the way of this. So Gnosticism is based on this struggle against the human soul as a particle of light that has to fight the astrological determinism of these archons that determine his life. Now this is somewhat similar to what the model that Kaczynski has built here, in which the technological society is itself a miniature cosmos. It's the city-state as a cosmos, which absolutely has trapped the human individual whose soul has fallen, not so much in the material world, but has fallen and become a prisoner of technological society, which now exerts its deterministic influences on him and has caught him and trapped him. And so Kaczynski's war against the scientists, he's mailing these bombs out to the scientists, is similar to the Gnostics' war against the archons, in that the scientists become for him a kind of unconscious equivalent, not that he knew anything about Gnosticism, I don't think he did, but they become for him a kind of Gnostic equivalent of the archons who have built and constructed the material world that has trapped the individual. The scientists and engineers of technological society have built this deterministic society that has become an iron cage that has trapped the modern individual. So he's mailing these bombs to these individuals in a way that suggests that if the individuals can be destroyed, the makers of this technological society can be destroyed, then he can attain freedom, liberate the trapped human soul from its technological prison, and escape. The pleroma in this case becomes structurally equivalent to nature, so that we have technological society that is equivalent to the Gnostic cosmos. The pleroma, which is equated with the realm of absolute freedom, becomes equated with the realm of Kaczynski's wild nature that he sees, that he fled to actually when he went to live in his cabin, as the ultimate means of escape and salvation of the modern human soul that has fallen and become captured by technology. So there are these interesting Gnostic, unconscious Gnostic structures in his thinking here that reveals this kind of, this sort of, he's sort of creating his own cosmology and doesn't realize that he's doing it. So there's some interesting ideas in Kaczynski, and I think his analysis of technology is actually very perceptive. I think there are a lot of good insights about it. I think that technology is deterministic. I think that it is absolutely, especially technology of the large-scale organizational kind that's involved with these institutions, does tend to rob the individual of freedom and autonomy and narrows our choices. It doesn't increase them, as its bill is doing. It doesn't increase our freedoms. It actually narrows and restricts them. And so one mode of possible response then to this type of society is to blow it up. And that's the strategy known as demolition. So we have with Kaczynski then an illustration of one means of the individual's response to technology. And it was important to discuss him because I think we're going to see more individuals of this type as the decades come, not fewer of them. So this is a bit of an ominous forecast. So that's it.